Every vessel shall use all available means appropriate to the prevailing circumstances or read conditions to determine if risk of collisions exist. If there is any doubt, such risk shall be deemed to exist. Meaning, if the watchkeeper has even the slightest doubt, he should assume that such risk exists and must act in accordance with the rules. Of course, when assessing such risk, he must consider the current conditions, the state of the sea, traffic density, visibility, and so on. All available means to assess risk refers to everything available to the watchkeeper: visual bearings, radar tracking or observations and plotting, sound signals, VHF traffic, and so on. Proper use shall be made of radar equipment if fitted and operational, including long-range scanning to obtain early warning of risk of collision and radar plotting or equivalent systematic observation of detected objects. Meaning, radar is a navigational aid and its use is now required and mandatory. The radar should be used as long as it is functional to warn the watchkeeper of the danger in as short a period of time as possible. This means that the radar must be used for a long-range scanning to detect ships and perform a radar plot to determine whether or not the ship possesses a hazard. Assumptions shall not be made on the basis of scanty information, especially scanty radar information. Scanty radar information. If the radar has been observed once in a while, then the assessment is not correct. The plot is required and then the plot has to be checked by following it up by further observations. In determining if risk of collision exists, the following considerations shall be among those taken into account. Such risk shall be deemed to exist if the compass hearing on approaching vessels does not applicably change. This fact is the most important. If the bearing changes for a ship at an appreciable range, then the risk factor is less. However, it has to be remembered that the change of bearing has to be appreciable or else the CPA would be insignificant and thus the risk would still exist. Such risk may sometimes exist when an appreciable bearing change is evident, particularly when approaching a very large vessel or a tow or when approaching a vessel at close range. As mentioned above, the bearing change should be very evident. However, sometimes this applicably large change may not hold true for observations of large vessels which subtained a significant angle at the observer. If the bow was being observed and the aspect of the ship changes from end on to a side, then too the bearing change would be evident. But that does not mean that the risk does not exist. So for large vessels, which subtained an angle at the observer care should be exercised. Any action to avoid collision shall be taken in accordance with the rule of this part and shall, if the circumstances of the case admit, be positive, made a number of time and with due regard to the observance of good seamanship. Qualification of the action. The action should be positive, meaning that it should result in the reduction of the risk of collision, not aggravate it. Any alteration of course and/or speed to avoid collision shall, if the circumstances of the case admit, be large enough to be readily apparent to the other vessels observing visual or by radar. A succession of small alterations of course and/or speed shall be avoided. The alteration, of course, always has to be large enough to be readily apparent to the other vessel. Small changes are not noticeable to the other vessel, since the aspect during daytime and the navigation light aspect at night may not appreciably differ from what it was before, the smaller alteration, of course. Regarding speed change, it is still harder to figure out when a vessel reduces from 40 knots to 30 knots. It is apparent if a vessel reduces from 40 knots directly to 10 knots. If there is a sufficient sea room, alteration of course alone may be the most effective action to avoid a close quarter situation, provided that it is made in good time. It's substantial and does not result in another close quarter situation. Rather than speed alteration, which being rather difficult to observe, as such is difficult to assess the situation, and the apparent track remains the same. Thus a course alteration is much more effective in diffusing a dangerous situation and also is readily apparent to the other vessels, provided however that the alteration can be observed very easily by the other vessel. The action should not be where the situation becomes worse, so it has to be done in time when the vessels are far away so that the action taken can be further assessed, and if rectification is required may be done. Action taken to avoid collision with the other vessel shall be such as to result in passing at a safe distance. The effectiveness of the action shall be carefully checked until the other vessels is finally passed and clear. As explained above, all actions has to be assessed after taking them. All actions should diffuse the dangerous situation and the passing of the vessels should be with as wide a margin as possible under the conditions. If necessary to avoid collision or allow more time to assess the situation, a vessel may slacken her speed or take all way off by stopping or reversing her means of propulsion. The above would happen in waters where ships are going in and out of the harbor limits. The ship may not have set a course, also that the speed may not have to sufficient vessels may head in some different way, especially when transferring pilot etc. Under the circumstances, it is better to either stop and watch the situation as it develops or even if required to stop the vessel in her tracks, no movement and then to assess the situation and then move cautiously. A vessel which by any of these rules is required not to impede the passage or safe passage of another vessel shall, when required by the circumstances of the case, take early action to allow sufficient sea room for the safe passage of another vessel. A vessel required not to impede the passage or safe passage of another vessel is not relieved of this obligation if approaching the other vessel so as to involve risk of collisions and shall, when taking action, have full regard to the action which may be required by the rules of this part. A vessel the passage of which is not to be impeded remains fully obliged to comply with the rules of this part when the two vessels are approaching one another so as to involve risk of collision. All of the above related to vessels which have been required to keep out of the way of vessels and not to hinder the passage of another vessel. For the stand-on vessel, it has to follow the rules irrespective of whether the other vessels takes action or not. Risk of collisions at any cost has to be avoided. These vessels should therefore take early actions to keep clear. But if they fail, then too they are obligated to follow the rules to avoid close quarters situation.